Hi everyone, I'm here today with a video lesson for everything that you need to know for an inspector calls for IGCSE literature. Now this video lesson is specifically aimed at those who are studying Edexcel literature. However, to be honest, there's only so many different things that an exam board could possibly test you for literature. For any exam board you're going to need to know symbols, characters, themes, etc. So if you're not doing Edexcel, all you need to do is skip forward a little bit past paper questions and you'll find lots and lots of things there that will be useful for you too. Don't forget that you can find more like this on my website, that's taughtly.co.uk, and that I do offer one-to-one tutoring, group classes, masterclasses, including one coming up for first language English, link is in the description, self-paced courses, and also teaching resources. So if you're interested in having class with me or finding more resources to support your studies, head over there. Beginning with my Edexcel specific stuff, remember if you're not doing Edexcel, just skip forward a little bit. But what are the assessment objectives for Edexcel? So an inspector calls will appear in your paper 2, so that's the drama paper. You'll have to study this along with a literary heritage text. Very popular texts include Macbeth, for example. So for an inspector calls, you're tested on 2 assessment objectives only. So you're tested on AO1, which is your knowledge of the text. So literally, do you know the events in the text? Do you know the character names? Do you know the best quotations to support your analysis? Can you write using a critical style, so staying academic and formal? And do you have an opinion? Do you have personal engagement? Do you have an argument that you can support with quotations and analysis? For AO2 then, this is our analysis of language, form and structure. We'll get deeper into that later, but obviously language is language, form is features of the fact that it is a play, and structure is how the play is organised and how does it build towards a climax. Do note that there is no AO4, so you are not tested for context. That's quite different compared to your novel and also to your literary heritage text. I do think it's a bit weird, to be honest, because for an inspector calls, you do need to know some context for some of the things to make sense. And that's why even though you're not testing on context, I'm still going to tell you context in this presentation because you literally can't understand the play without knowing some context. But you don't technically need to include it at all in your essay. Here are some past paper questions for Edexcel. If you're doing a different exam board, most literature questions look basically the same. The only difference might be some exam boards do like to do extract based response where you've got a short extract you need to analyse, whereas for Edexcel it's just a big general essay question. Past paper questions. Mr. Burling talking about Eva or Daisy. She had a lot to say, I remember. Far too much. What does the audience learn about Eva Smith / Daisy Renton from how other characters treat her in the play? Or explore the differences between the older and younger generations in an inspector calls. Notice here that you will have a choice of 2 questions, so if you don't like one you can pick the other one. It is generally a character question and a theme question. So here we've got the character of Eva Smith and the theme of old and young generations, theme of age. How far do you agree with the view that the ending of inspector calls is successful? Sheila, he never seemed like an ordinary police inspector. How far do you agree with this view of the inspector in the play? How does the character of Eric Burling change in Inspector Calls? And things are not always what they appear to be in the Burling household. Explore the theme of appearance and reality in the play. Explore the significance of the title of the play and Inspector Calls. Or discuss the presentation of one character you sympathise with and why. If you get a question like this, it's a little bit of a gift from the gods, right? Because you can therefore write your essay about whoever you want, whoever you've revised the best. Obvious choices here would be Eva Smith or Sheila, Eric perhaps to a certain extent because he does repent what he's done and he does change. Might be wise to not do the Burlings, that could be weird. And I also know that there are some of you out there that like to be unique, shall we say, that might be tempted to do an Edna essay. There's probably not going to be enough for you to say there. But I mean, for this one, it is quite nice because at least it gives you options. Now, in terms of an essay structure, there are some suggestions that I have. The one that generally works best for an inspector calls is this one. So we begin with an introduction and we end with a conclusion, as always. But I suggest structuring your paragraphs as before the inspector comes, while the inspector is there and his interrogations, and after the inspector has left. Now, obviously, this isn't going to work great for an essay about to what extent is the ending of the play effective, or what is the significance of the title of the play. But for 90% of the essay questions, this would work well. And I think it's good because it forces you to talk about the beginning, middle and ending of the play, therefore showing good knowledge. And so many students ignore the ending of the play, which Like, that's where the message of the play happens. So it forces you to really think about, well, what is the aftermath of the inspector's visit? You can also go for an introduction, conclusion, and then in the middle you go at first, then, however. So at first it seems that the inspector is da 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 da. Then we realise da 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 da. However, by the end of the play we realise that his identity is not important, and that the final message of the play is more important than any particular individual. So you're kind of going like first impressions, second impressions, and then some sort of like counter argument or some complicating of your argument there. Okay, let's get stuck into context now. So the context points that I'm going to talk about are capitalism versus socialism, post-war Britain, the Labour Party, and 1912 versus 1945. Beginning with capitalism and socialism. So the Burling family, they represent that capitalist values. Capitalism would be defined as a system in which individualism is prioritised above the collective, so that the individual has the right to make as much money as they can for themselves, for their family, for their business. By contrast, socialism might tax a little bit more and redistribute that wealth to try and create a more fair and equal society and support those who perhaps can't look after themselves. So essentially, capitalism is individualism and socialism is collectivism. I've heavily simplified there, but that's basically what you need to know for the play. So Mr. Burling represents those capitalist values of individualism and profit. A key quote there would be when he says, "A man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his family." Well, this is quite an interesting quote because mind his own business, that's got a double meaning, right? Mind his own business as in pay attention only to himself, be individualist, but also literally mind his own business as in his own profit, his own wealth. So dual meanings there. There's also some irony because Mr. Burling says he has to look after himself and his family. Well, look at the order of that sentence. Himself first, family second. But the irony comes because Mr. Burling doesn't do that. He doesn't know that Gerald is cheating on his daughter. He doesn't know that his son is an alcoholic. And by the end of the play, he doesn't even very much care. So he's not looking after his family. So he's a hypocrite. The inspector, by contrast, embodies these socialist ideals of collective responsibility. The idea that we should be looking after everyone and not just selfishly looking after ourselves. So when the inspector says we are members of one body, he's there acting as a mouthpiece for Priestley's own socialist values. When I say a mouthpiece, it's like he's a self-insert character for J.B. Priestley. It's basically the inspector's put in there to say the message of the play. So we are members of one body, we all belong to one body. A metaphor there to show that we're all interdependent and interconnected with each other, but also got some religious connotations like the body of Christ, because there's some implication that the inspector is almost a godlike character. So this could be a good quotation for that too. Eva Smith then, she represents the exploitation of the working classes under capitalism. So this is like the victim of Mr. Burling's ideology. And overall the play critiques this capitalist system and advocates for social reform, especially after the destruction of World War II. So this is really the main message of the play. So if you don't know about socialism and capitalism, you need to know it for the exam. Now, as we've said, this play was written in 1945, post-war Britain. So this reflects J.B. Priestley's desire for social change after World War I, after World War II. Now think about it, in World War II, men fought side by side. So whether you were upper class, middle class, lower class, you were all together in the same situation, living under the same conditions. And because of that, deep friendships and relationships began to form between the men fighting together, and there was an increased sense of empathy for one another. So those in power suddenly could no longer be like, the poor are just stupid and lazy, because they worked with them during the war. They knew that that wasn't true. So there was this real chance and optimism for change and that we could build a fairer society after World War II. There was a growing awareness of social inequalities and emphasising a collective responsibility in rebuilding efforts. So don't forget that after World War II, Britain was destroyed. And I mean that literally in terms of its infrastructure, its roads, its buildings, and it had to be literally rebuilt. And so there were many things that were done, like rebuilding houses and so on, that we'll talk about very, very shortly. But also don't forget that you had all of these soldiers who'd literally fought for their country. They came back, in some cases missing arms, missing legs, mentally scarred from the process. And so therefore the country has to look after these people who were willing to sacrifice their lives. Now a key event in 1945 is After the war was over, the Labour Party got in power in the UK, where this play was written. The Labour Party are a more left-wing socialist party, so they're more similar to J.B. Priestley's own socialist views. And they won in a landslide victory, meaning that they won overwhelmingly in the 1945 general election. What were the Labour Party committed to? Well, they created a welfare state. So this idea of like a social safety net, that all of the basic things will be provided for by the state. So they built houses, they committed themselves to free education and also to free healthcare. So they set up the NHS, the National Health Service, in 1948, which is free medical care at the point of use. Essentially, anyone could walk into a hospital and get treated without paying any money whatsoever at any point during that process. And again, that's because after the war, they kind of had an obligation to do that. How can you refuse medical treatment when the reason why people are sick and unwell is because they fought for their country? They were trying to reduce poverty and improve living conditions, for example, by building that affordable housing. So building nice quality houses that were cheap, that everyday normal people could live in. So this leads me finally on to, well, what were the differences between 1945 and 1912? So don't forget, the play was written and first performed in 1945, but the events are set in 1912 before both World War I and World War II. So in 1912, people were complacent, right? They took things for granted. They thought that everything would be fine. And they also had much more rigid class structures. So you can refer to the rigid class structures of this Edwardian era in 1912. But in 1945, although it was bleak because of the destruction of the war, it was more hopeful, more optimistic, because the Labour Party were coming in, because we had the NHS being set up, because we had affordable housing, and because we created this welfare state that emphasised collective responsibility and looking after everyone in society, moving slightly away from those individualist capitalist values. So since it's set in 1912, shortly before the First World War, it becomes this warning to the 1945 audience who have just experienced World War II, a horrific war. And that warning is that we must learn from our mistakes or else they will be repeated. So don't just think, well, war will never come to Britain and everything is fine. You actually need to be learning from what has happened before so that war doesn't reoccur. Now, this cyclical nature, things happening again and again in the cycle, that's shown by the Burling's mistakes. So think about the structure of the play, right? It starts and ends with an inspector coming, and there's some suggestion there that the Burlings, by the end of the play, the older Burlings, don't learn from their past mistakes. And so therefore they're doomed to repeat the same cycle again. So that structure there is warning us of this message: we must learn from our past. And in fact, the inspector almost exactly says that. He warns of violence and destruction when he says, "If men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." So we must learn from our mistakes. Now, the fire and blood and anguish, that could be a reference to war, or it could also be a reference to hell, right? So there's a sense of there will be a consequence, whether on earth or in the afterlife, if you believe in that. Now I'm going to talk you through Priestley's intentions. So I bet your teacher always says to you, but what were the writer's intentions, right? Why did they write this play? So these writer's intention statements, they can be used as thesis statements in your introduction. They also work really beautifully in a conclusion so that you're making a deeper point and not just repeating what you've already said. Or they might also be useful for linking some of your analysis to a slightly deeper point. And before we do Priestley's intentions, look here, please don't spell his name incorrectly. I get so many essays where it's missing the E and it's Priestley L-Y, but it's not. It's L-E-Y, L-E-Y, right? So make sure that you sear that into your brains for your exams, because it doesn't make it look like you know the play very well if you can't spell the author's surname correctly. Here are my thesis statements then. Priestley's An Inspector Calls exposes middle-class hypocrisy, challenging the audience to confront their own moral failings. So this idea of being a hypocrite and therefore thinking about what you yourself are doing wrong morally. The play's central message emphasises collective responsibility, urging viewers to recognise their interconnectedness within society, that we are members of one body, and that you can't just look after your own business and your own family. By implicating nearly all characters, Priestley critiques society for neglecting its most vulnerable members. So it's not just Mr. and Mrs. Burling who hurt Eva, it is the whole Burling family and Gerald. So therefore it's a critique of all of us and what we do to the weakest members of our society. Eva Smith's universal victimhood symbolises the systemic abuse of the working class by those in power. so that she's a universal character symbolising all working class victims and how they are abused by those who have the means of production, who own the factories in which the working classes work in. Priestley's play serves as a mirror, compelling the audience to critically examine their own actions and social responsibilities. So the idea that this play is didactic, which means it's teaching a moral message. And so the audience is supposed to therefore learn a message and reflect upon their own actions. Final 3 thesis statements. Through the characters' transformations, Priestley illustrates the potential for personal growth and societal progress. So there is some optimism here, right? There is the sense that we can do better than this and we can learn from our mistakes, as symbolised through the growth of both Eric and Sheila. Priestley uses the inspector as a mouthpiece to advocate for collective social responsibility in post-war Britain. So the fact that the inspector is his mouthpiece, and what is his message? Collective social responsibility, arguing for a more socialist approach to rebuilding Britain. And finally, Priestley exposes the dangers of unchecked, uncontrolled capitalism and its impact on vulnerable members of society. Okay, now we are going to go through character by character and think about what do each of them symbolise. Beginning first of all with Sheila. So Sheila is transitional, meaning that she changes, she transitions over the course of the play. She is sympathetic. I personally think the most sympathetic member of the Burling family. She's compassionate. For example, she's horrified when she first learns of her impact on Eva Smith. She doesn't need to be convinced. And she is self-reflective. She realises her mistakes and she learns from them and she grows. She acts as a dramatic vehicle to promote socialism and undergoes growth. She begins the play conceited, naive, self-obsessed, and ends the play more mature, more critical. So through her, Priestley shows that the younger generation are capable of change and that they actually have these changing values that will benefit Britain. Do also notice that as a woman she is a bartering object, like she is an object to be sold by Mr. Burling. He essentially sells her off to Gerald's family, the Crofts, highlighting her role in Edwardian Britain. Of course, she does have a say in this. Her match with Gerald is a love match, but Mr. Burling very much wants that marriage to continue even after Sheila no longer wants that anymore. Then we have got Eric. So like Sheila, he is also transitional in that he changes throughout the course of the play. He does wrong, but he is remorseful for it, and he is also a very privileged character. He's quite spoiled. He is more of a morally ambiguous character because there is a suggestion that he may have sexually assaulted Eva. We see that when he says when he entered her apartment because he was in a state where things may have turned nasty. So in other words, she didn't really want him to enter her apartment, but she was a little bit afraid of him. So therefore there's some implication that she probably or may not have wanted that encounter to happen. That particular plotline is debatable. That's just my personal interpretation of the events. Now Eric is a drunk. It says that he's often squiffy, which means drunk. And he is repentant, he feels bad about what he's done. And he also tells his parents that he's ashamed of them and their actions. So he has grown as the play goes on. And he does accept his responsibility by the end of the play, much like Sheila. For Mr. Burling, he is a symbol of both capitalism and of patriarchy. He's described as being a hard-headed, practical man of business. Well, hard-headed and practical, not suggesting any emotional reflectiveness. Hard-headed often means that people are quite stubborn. He is himself a social climber because it says at the start of the play that his accent is provincial and that that Mrs. Burling is her husband's social superior. So there's some implication there that he's a self-made man who perhaps came from a more working class background and has climbed the social ladder and now might even be getting a knighthood. So really climbing that social ladder. He has got a very fixed mindset and takes no responsibility for his actions, no remorse whatsoever. He's learnt nothing. The audience, they're encouraged to disagree with him and with his worldview, therefore also to disagree with his capitalist thoughts too. And we most see that when we've got his incorrect predictions about the Titanic, which is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and that war will never come to Europe, which, don't forget, the 1945 audience would know is complete nonsense. The Titanic sunk on its first voyage, and not only did one war come to Europe, but two that were absolutely horrific. So therefore, if he's wrong about those things, the audience is encouraged to think that he's probably wrong about everything else as well. He is an individualist and he exploits others for his own gain. For example, even Sheila's marriage is opportunistic for him. Mrs. Burling. She is elitist, dismissive and injudicious. She's also a dramatic vehicle to criticise capitalism, and she symbolises the arrogance of the upper classes and the ignorance of the older generation. She's morally inferior and detestable, good word, and the audience is encouraged to dislike her elitist views. Much like Mr. Berlin, lots of that is done through that dramatic irony, where the audience and Sheila come to realise much sooner than Mrs. Berlin that it's actually Eric, her son, who got Eva pregnant. And Mrs. Berling is very, very hypocritical in that she says, oh, what should we do with him? You know, we should lock him away, we should hold him accountable. But then when she realises it's her son, her opinions change. So she's a hypocrite, much like Mr. Berlin. She comes from old money, so she's part of the establishment. And although she's a woman, she's not a girl's girl. Not a girl's girl. She reinforces patriarchal expectations, for example, by refusing to help Eva out when she's pregnant and she comes to Mrs. Berling's charity for help. Surely, like, the women that you want to help are people in those vulnerable situations. But Mrs. Berling says that she doesn't want to help. But Mrs. Berling refers to Eva as girls of that class. So she's very much judging Eva because of her working class background. On to Gerald, Mr. Gerald Croft. He is traditional, wealthy and dismissive. So he is kind of in between the Berlings and the younger generation in that he's in his 30s, whereas Sheila and Eric are in their 20s. But although he is one of the younger characters, he doesn't change. But I think that this is because Gerald is old money. So he comes from this capitalist system that directly benefits him. You know, he's got this ancestral wealth that has been passed down from generation to generation. So that becomes a lot harder for you to want to change something that has benefited your family for generations. He is duplicitous and untrustworthy, because we find out that he was cheating on Sheila all summer. Like, imagine if your fiancé not only cheated on you, but like put his girlfriend up in an apartment. Like, that is some serious betrayal right there. And much like he does Sheila dirty, he also does Eva dirty too, because once he's done with her, he just discards her. He knows that she's in a very vulnerable position when he first finds her, and yet once he's done with her, he's like, here's some money, off you go. And he doesn't check in with her again, and he knows that her situation was desperate before she met him. Sheila says, oh, you just wanted to be the knight in shining armour. So essentially everything is about Gerald's ego, and he's not really caring about the other people in his life, especially the women in his life. Gerald refuses to change or to learn his lesson. In fact, it's Gerald who investigates the inspector, hoping to find an easy out, an easy excuse so that he doesn't have to take any responsibility. You know, it's Gerald who goes off stage, it's Gerald who finds out that the inspector wasn't a real inspector, and then at the end of the play he's quite happy to take absolutely no responsibility for anything that he did, and just wants to get married to Sheila and have everything returned back to the way that it was before, no lessons learned whatsoever. He just wants to resume the status quo, meaning he wants the order to go back to exactly how it was before. And we see that especially when he says, everything's all right now, Sheila, holds up the ring. What about this ring? So he wants to return to the way that things were before and refuses to change. And then we've also got the inspector, Inspector Ghoul. So the inspector is omniscient, he's all-knowing, he's prophetic, he knows what will happen in the future, right? Because he knows that there will be a girl who dies by drinking disinfectant and committing suicide before it's actually even happened. He's systematic. He systematically, one by one, goes through the Berlins with their interrogation with this very rigid plan. He's godlike, and he is Priestley's mouthpiece for socialist ideals. He is, in every single way, the antithesis of Mr. Berling, which means the complete opposite. He is morally superior and godlike, as we've said, and the audience are encouraged to admire him and therefore admire his socialist agenda. His name, Ghoul, sounds like the word ghoul, meaning ghost, Ghoul, right? So there's some suggestion there that he could be a ghost, or maybe he's just a physical manifestation of the Berling's guilt. Like, guilt becomes a person. His key message to the Berlings is, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. And do notice that the inspector, although he's in the title of the play, he's actually absent at both the beginning and the ending of the play. But by the end of the play, Eric and Sheila almost become like the inspector themselves. They take on his role, they critique their parents in the same way that the inspector was doing. Our final character is Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton. So Eva is vulnerable, she is a lonely victim of injustice. She is also an everywoman, a universal figure of working class suffering. So she is a dramatic vehicle to represent the demonised and neglected working classes to promote socialism. She's moral, but she's abused, so the audience is encouraged to sympathise with her, and she is financially, emotionally and physically abused by each and every member of the Burling family. She is used by Priestley to show that the lower classes aren't just cheap labour, they're people, says Sheila. So to humanise the working classes, essentially. And as we've said, she is this every woman. She is not an individual victim, but a universal one. That's perhaps shown by her name. So Eva, which sounds a lot like Eve. So Adam and Eve from the Bible, the first man and woman. Smith is a very, very common British surname, again suggesting that she's representative of more than just herself. And within Daisy Renton, so rent as in to rent something but not to keep it for a long time, right? It doesn't become yours. I almost feel like that's what Gerald does. He rents her, but he doesn't buy her, if that makes sense. And Daisy being a flower, a white flower, suggesting innocence, purity. On now to the genre of the play. So there's a few interesting elements of the genre. So we're going to talk about the three unities, that it's a whodunit play, that it's a morality play, and it's links to A Christmas Carol. So An Inspector Calls follows the three unities. And the three unities come from ancient Greek theatre. They are unity of action, time and place. So by unity of action we mean that there is one plot with no subplots, no distractions. By unity of time, all of the events occur within a single day. And by unity of place, that everything happens in a single location with no scene or set changes. So the unity of action is adhered to because the whole plot is about the investigation of Eva Smith's death. All of the events take place in a single evening, and the whole play is set in the Burling family dining room. So you can say that J.B. Priestley adhered to the three unities to heighten both dramatic tension, but also so that his audience could focus on his single moral lesson. The play is also a whodunit mystery. Whodunit meaning who did it becomes who done it becomes who done it. So it's basically like a detective plot of who done the murder, right? So a whodunit is a plot-driven detective story which focuses on solving a single puzzle. The reader will be given clues before the final reveal. The investigations are often led by an eccentric, strange detective, and the golden age of writing whodunits in the 1920s and 1940s. And of course, An Inspector Calls was written in 1945. Famous whodunit authors would be people like Agatha Christie. Now within whodunits we've got character archetypes, typical characters that we would expect to see. Think of these similar to An Inspector Calls. So we've got an eccentric detective, an arrogant lord or lady of the manor, a posh, roguish playboy, and a spoiled, overindulged daughter. Sound familiar, guys? Within the whodunits, you've got a very typical structure where we begin with no clear culprit at first. The detective uncovers unsavoury events whilst interviewing the suspects, and then at the end, the detective gathers everyone together to explain their motives and to explain the crime. And at the end of the story, you will have that final reveal to find out who done it. Now notice that this whodunit structure is kind of reversed in An Inspector Calls. So with whodunits, it's usually like we narrow it down. We've got a pool of suspects and then eventually find the one person who done it. By contrast, in An Inspector Calls, by the end of the play, we find out everyone done it, right? Everyone is responsible. Everyone is culpable. So you can say that the play subverts the genre of whodunit mysteries. As J.B. Priestley shows by the end of the play, every single character is responsible. There is no one murderer. They together have murdered this every woman, Eva Smith. An Inspector Calls is also a morality play. So morality play meaning a play designed to teach you a lesson, a moral lesson between what's right and what's wrong. So within morality plays, you usually have a main character who represents humanity or who is a sinner. You will have the personified virtues and vices as supporting characters. So within the Bible, you might have the vices, things like lust, greed, gluttony, virtues like patience and so on. And the central theme will often be this struggle between good and evil. And morality plays were popular in medieval and early Tudor periods. Now we do see the Burlings personifying sins in many ways. For example, Arthur Burling represents greed. He is obsessed with wealth and business success. Sybil Burling represents pride. She's arrogant, she's self-righteous, she dismisses the responsibility of others. Sheila Burling represents envy, jealousy, because she's jealous of Eva Smith's beauty, and this is what causes her to get her fired from Millwards. Eric Burling represents lust, as does Gerald, of course. He's impulsive and irresponsible in his actions towards Eva, and Gerald also indulges in an affair for his own selfish pleasures. Now, critics have said that actually an Inspector Calls is a morality play disguised as a thriller, or disguised as a whodunit. So on the surface it appears to be a whodunit, but actually it's a morality play. So that's all related to what we spoke about earlier. So usually whodunits narrow down suspects to a single one, but an Inspector Calls inverts this process, as one by one nearly all of the characters in the play are found to be guilty. So by doing this, Priestley makes his larger point that all of society is guilty for neglecting the working classes, and that a just society is one that respects and exercises social responsibility. Now we see something very, very similar to this in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I bet most of you guys have some familiarity with this novel, even if it's just watching a Muppets Christmas Carol at Christmas time. I feel like that's a really common film that teachers put on in the last week before holidays. So A Christmas Carol, now think, how is this similar to an Inspector Calls? Well, both of them have got supernatural visitors, ghosts, or the Inspector Ghost, who prompt moral reflection. They've both got protagonists who start as selfish capitalists and are resistant to change, in this case Scrooge and Mr. Burling primarily. They both critique social inequality and advocate for collective responsibility. But unlike Scrooge, Mr. Burling doesn't undergo a journey of self-discovery, he doesn't grow. And both texts were written with clear social messages aiming to reform society. Onwards now to the themes of an Inspector Calls. So for the themes, I'm not going to go into them in like lots and lots of depth because I feel like we just end up talking about the same thing again and again. But what I'm aiming to do here is to give you a thesis statement so that if you got a question about any of these themes, you've already got your initial argument. For age then. So age highlights how true change can come from the younger generations, that they act as this hope for the future. The generational divide between the old and the young shows different values, the older being more established elites, more selfish, more individualist, whereas the younger generation are more open to reflection and accepting that perhaps things haven't been done perfectly and that we could do better. In terms of gender then, we've got that gender within the play exposes social inequality and the need for women's empowerment. Because even though Sheila is a member of the upper classes, both Sheila and Eva are mistreated because of their gender, because they are women. So of course this situation becomes worse for Eva, because as a working class woman life is harder for you. But Sheila also has elements of patriarchy that are pushed upon her. For example, this engagement with Gerald, which her father is encouraging even at the end of the play, knowing that Gerald was cheating on her all summer. Thanks, Dad. Social responsibility, it represents the interconnectedness of society and the consequences of individual actions on collective welfare. In other words, what you do as an individual affects society as a whole, and so we should be acting with social responsibility and kindness to one another. We are all members of one body, guys. Capitalism and socialism, so the clash of these two ideologies within the play, acts as a critique of capitalism specifically and argues in favour of a more socially responsible and compassionate socialism. And this theme of capitalism versus socialism can be represented through the two characters of Mr. Burling versus the Inspector. Class. So Eva Smith is an every woman who symbolises the universal suffering of the working classes at the hands of the elite, the Burlings. So she shows the effect of this cumulative cruelty that the upper classes put on the most vulnerable members of our society. And finally, appearances and reality. So the Burlings appear to be fine, upstanding members of our society. In fact, Mr. Burling might even get a knighthood. But the reality is actually they are cruel, selfish and uncaring people. So this theme unveils the hypocrisy of respectable society, that those that are at the top of the social hierarchy are actually hypocrites and the cruelest of us all. It challenges these superficial moral standards. The Burlings appear to be upright, fine citizens, but this is not the truth. Now we're going to go over the form and structure of an Inspector Calls. This part here is really, really useful for those of you guys aiming for the top marks, so for grades 8 or grades 9. Because what I tend to find is that students who score those higher marks, they don't just analyse language or characterisation, but they go a bit deeper and they think about the play as a whole. They think about how it's organised, they think about how it's adhering to different features of the theatre. So if you are aiming for those higher marks, pay close attention right here, because I've got some good stuff for you guys, right? So this is what we will be covering. Dramatic irony, repetition of key phrases, use of setting and lighting, cyclical structure, 3-act structure, cliffhangers, ambiguous ending, and monologues and length of speaking. So we see dramatic irony throughout the play. Dramatic irony, in case you don't know, is when the audience knows something that the characters on stage do not. So for example, Mr. Burling's overconfident and incorrect predictions when he says that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and that there won't be a war in Europe. The 1945 audience already know that this isn't true, so the audience knows something that the character does not, and this makes us mistrust him and therefore be more susceptible to Priestley's socialist message through the inspector. When Mr. Burling says that he's going to get a knighthood, so long as we behave ourselves and don't get into the police court or start a scandal, well, that's some dramatic irony, because the audience already know that the name of the play is An Inspector Calls. So we know that an inspector, a police officer, is going to come. He does not yet know that, therefore dramatic irony. And when Mrs. Burling forcefully blames some drunken young idler for Eva's pregnancy, but she's actually describing her own son, we know that, Sheila knows that, but Mrs. Burling does not know that, therefore dramatic irony. We've also got repetition of key phrases or key ideas, especially this idea of responsibility. So when Mr. Burling says a man has to mind his own business and look after his own at the start of the play, but the inspector says we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other, this idea of repetition creates this cycle, right, of this is how we begin and how do we end. Now for Mr. Burling, by the end, he still has this mindset, he still believes he has to mind his own business, so he's not learned and he's not grown at all. We can consider the use of setting and lighting too in the play. So don't forget before that we said that the play is set in a single room, in the Burling's dining room. And so could that be a symbol of their self-absorption, their self-obsession, and how disconnected they are from the wider world, the fact that we are only in one location? Also think about the stage directions of how the room is described. So their dining room is described as having walls that are imposing but tasteless pictures and engravings. So money can't buy you taste, right? It's kind of like tacky, cheesy, not very beautifully decorated, even though it's obviously had a lot of money spent on it. And that the general effect is substantial and comfortable, like an old-fashioned but not cosy and home-like. So this not cosy, not home-like suggests that actually, although they've got all this money, they're not compassionate, they're not loving, their family aren't particularly close. And I didn't put it on my slide, but also don't forget, in the stage directions, it says that the play begins with soft pink lighting, which becomes brighter and harsher when the inspector arrives. So that change in lighting can represent that kind of interrogation. You know, think about a police interrogation, they shine a bright light on you and it reveals all of your flaws and your sins. So the change in lighting can represent the start of the inspector's interrogation. The play follows a cyclical structure. So we start with the phone ringing to say an inspector is going to come, and we end the same way also with the phone ringing saying that an inspector will come. So Priestley was really fascinated with circularity, and the play ends as it begins. Because of this, there's a sense that the events will repeat themselves. And when they repeat themselves, the characters have a choice. Will they act better? Or will they act the same? Will they learn from their mistakes? For the younger Burlings, the answer is yes. For the older Burlings, the answer is no. So it's only Eric and Sheila who have actually learned. So there's this warning that if they continue to act selfishly, then the Burlings' actions will lead to the deaths of many more Eva and John Smiths. If we don't learn from our past, history will repeat. Also that message there of the war, right? If we don't learn from our past, then we will learn it in fire and blood and anguish. That's emphasised by the cyclical structure. The play is divided into a 3-act structure. So we've got Act 1, Act 2 and Act 3. So within Act 1, we've got the introduction to the Burlings before the inspector comes, and then we've got our initial interrogations. After that, in Act 2, we've got further revelations and questioning. So this is lots and lots of interrogations. And in Act 3, we've got our climax, resolution and the final twist. That's learning that the inspector isn't real, but actually a new inspector is coming because there was a girl who actually died. So we've got some suspense and tension created by this 3-act structure because each of the acts ends with a cliffhanger, so ramping up that tension each time. So this gradual build-up of dramatic tension with each revelation. What are the cliffhangers? Well, at the end of Act 1, we end with the inspector saying "well" to Gerald, so we're waiting to find out, did Gerald know Eva Smith? How did he know her? At the end of Act 2, we end by realising that Eric is probably the father of Eva Smith's unborn child. And at the end of Act 3, we end with the family believing that they've escaped the consequences, but the phone rings. They've learned another woman dies from drinking disinfectant and that a real police inspector is on the way to question them about the suicide. So we once again end in this suspense, waiting to find out, will the Burlings actually learn from their past actions? Now, because it does end in a cliffhanger, we can say that the ending is ambiguous. Ambiguous means unclear, uncertain, unknown. So the play ends with naked displays of hypocrisy, the Burlings not having learned their lesson. When it's confirmed that Gould is not really a policeman, Arthur, Sybil and Gerald immediately think, how dare he do that? Let's go back to life as it was before. They learn nothing. And as soon as they find out that there wasn't really a girl that died and that Eva Smith might not even be the same person for each of them, they think, great, we've got away with it, no big deal. They think that they don't need to learn anything, and they start talking about how they're going to get away with everything, and that Mr. Burling can still get his knighthood. But actually, I would argue that it doesn't really matter if there was one Eva Smith, right? The point is that the Burlings still did those actions. So Mr. Burling still fired her for asking for a higher wage. Sheila still got her fired from Millwoods. Gerald still abandoned her after taking advantage of her for a whole summer. Eric still sexually assaulted her and left her pregnant. And Mrs. Burling still refused her charity when she needed help. So whether or not these are individual different women or whether it's the same woman, you still did the terrible thing. But by the end of the play, we're not actually clear if all of them have actually learnt that lesson and know that it doesn't matter who Eva Smith was, what matters was their actions. We see throughout the play too many monologues and interruptions. Monologues being one person talking for a very long time, and interruptions, well, if you interrupt someone, that means that you're taking the power in the conversation away from them. You're saying what I've got to say is more important than what you've got to say. So at the start of the play, Mr. Burling dominates conversations. He monologues for a long time. So this shows that he's got an inflated ego and dismissive to those around him. He's not interested in what anyone else has got to say. He's got long turns of speaking. That could symbolise his individualist nature, right? He only really cares about himself. But later on, the inspector interrupts Burling. This is him asserting his power, asserting his moral dominance. And later on, Eric and Sheila begin to interrupt too, showing that they have broken away from Burling's control, they're challenging him, and they've got their own perspective on the world, finally. They're finally beginning to think for themselves. Thinking now about symbols and motifs that we see throughout the play, and these are the symbols that we're going to discuss. The disinfectant, the engagement ring, the Titanic, alcohol and champagne, the phone and the photograph. So the disinfectant, this is how Eva Smith kills herself. So the fact that it's disinfectant, something that we use to clean with, does that represent societal purity and the destruction caused by neglect and exploitation, this kind of wiping away? And it's a really horrible way for her to die. The inspector describes it as having burned her from the inside out. And the word choice here, that the disinfectant burned her, makes us think once again of hellfire and sin, of the inspector's quote, "If you don't learn it, we will learn it in anguish and blood and fire." It's also used for cleaning. So is it showing how society has dirtied Eva, both metaphorically through capitalist greed and also physically because it's forced her into prostitution and sin against her will? The engagement ring. So the engagement ring symbolises superficial relationships and materialism. It's expensive, but it's just an object. And this highlights the transactional nature of some of the relationships, especially between Gerald and Sheila. But it also symbolises Sheila's growth, because she begins the play by being very excited by the play, saying, "Oh, mummy, have you seen the ring?" Then she gives it away in the middle of the play, and at the end of the play, Gerald tries to give it back to her and she refuses to take it. So it symbolises her growth and her breaking away from patriarchal power. The Titanic. So this symbolises Mr. Burling's hubris, which means excessive pride and arrogance. and his false confidence. It's ironic, dramatic irony, and it foreshadows the disaster that will come later on in the play. In many ways, don't the Burlings sink is the inspector, their iceberg. It symbolises Burling's arrogance and overconfidence as well as his stupidity. And I've just at this point, yes, the Burlings are about to sink just like the Titanic sunk. Alcohol and champagne. So this symbolises escapism, indulgence and the vices of privilege, especially Eric's moral failings, essentially a symbol of moral decay. Now think about champagne especially, this is associated as being a very expensive drink, so it is a symbol of wealth. Could it also symbolise that the upper class are completely numb or numbing themselves to the suffering of the poor? We've got the symbol of the phone that rings at the start of the play and rings again at the end of the play. So it's a symbol of authority and of consequence. The external world is closing in on the Burlings, and is it the call of justice that they're now going to get their punishment for all of their wrongs? Our final symbol is the photograph. So remember that the inspector shows each of the Burlings a photograph of who he says is Eva Smith, but none of the Burlings actually see the photograph at the same time. So it could be a photograph of lots and lots of different girls. It is a symbol of exposing secrets, unravelling the Burlings' lies, forcing self-reflection, and a symbol of their guilt. But it could also symbolise the inspector's deception, because none of them are looking at the same photo at the same time. But in a way, it doesn't really matter. So it doesn't matter who the photograph is of, because the Burlings still committed the same actions. So therefore, could it also symbolise the interconnectedness of the characters' actions and the consequences of their decisions? It doesn't matter if it's the same photograph, doesn't matter if it's the same girl, we are all still connected to one another, and we are all still responsible for one another. And you guys always ask for key quotations. I'm not going to analyse them because this video is too long, but I will flash them up on the screen for your revision notes should you want them. So here are my recommended key quotations. I've got 3 slides, I think. So here's the first slide, here is the second slide, and here's the third slide. Finally, here is some useful vocabulary for you guys that would work really well in a literary essay, not only to impress your examiner, but also to allow you to talk about deeper points with more precise vocabulary. So I'll just flash them on the screen and feel free to go away and have a look at those. If you made it to the end of this revision lesson, well done you. You are dedicated to your learning. Thank you so much. Don't forget that you can find more like this over on my website, that's taughtly.co.uk. And if you are interested in doing some tutoring with me, I do one-to-one self-formed classes and masterclasses, including a first language masterclass that's coming up very soon. More details in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.